In the previous videos, I've been talking about the film look or so-called cinematic look, and in this part, let's start with the exposure triangle in the context of mobile filmmaking. Although these same three adjustments remain responsible for achieving the desired mixture of light and shadows of the image, adjusting them may have already changed. Too much brightness or too much darkness may not always be your desired look for your image. Most of the time, you might want just the right amount of light and shadows to reveal certain details in the picture, especially in getting that film or cinematic look. The recommended exposure is getting enough details in the brighter side of the picture and in the darker side. That's what professionals aim to do, and that's why they go for those log color profiles that look overly flat and boring, but all the necessary details are there. That's where you add more shadows and more light, or less light, more shadows, or the other way around, or change the color tones to enhance the mood. That's why I'd like to consider log as the final ingredient in getting cinematic exposure. While we are shooting, we need to get the most details as possible, and that's when we need to check that histogram, that weird statistical graph you often ignore in your camera. But this time, it would help if you check it out and see if that mountain shape or something is relatively at the center. Too much of that on the left or too much of that on the right will not produce the exposure we are after. And to make sure we get the right exposure, let's proceed to our exposure triangle. These are aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. First of all, aperture is that opening inside the lens of the camera that allows light to enter and be captured by the film or digital sensor. In the older lenses, the size of the opening could be adjusted from a very small opening to a larger one, depending on the type of lens. If the opening is too small, a smaller yet concentrated amount of light enters. At certain times, this small amount is enough to make an exposure, but at other times, it may not be enough. That's why you need to open it much wider. A smaller opening provides a much sharper and deeper depth of field, or objects appearing in the foreground, midground, and background will be sharper. That's why there is a need for that small opening. On the other hand, a wider opening allows more light and therefore images appear much brighter, but while you get a sharp image in focus, it creates a narrow depth of field resulting to a relatively blurry foreground or background. At certain times, it is a much desired effect. Lenses like those in DSLR or mirrorless cameras allow adjustments of apertures. Aperture values are those numbers with an F prefix like f1.8, f5.6, f8, f16, and the likes. Smaller numbers have larger openings and therefore brighter. The higher ones, needless to say, have smaller openings and has deeper, sharper depth of field. In mobile phone cameras, these aperture values are fixed. You cannot adjust these apertures anymore. Most cameras boast of low aperture values like f1.6, f2.0, f2.4, and more. Cameras like this take in more light to allow shooting indoors or during nighttime. It's going to be a serious struggle to shoot indoors or at night if aperture values are set to f8 or higher. You will need serious artificial lighting or a very slow shutter speed to get an exposure. In mobile filmmaking, you are left with two adjustments to get the proper exposure: ISO and shutter speed. ISO is an acronym for International Organization for Standardization. In camera jargon, it refers to light sensitivity of a film that captures the image. In those days, when film used to be the medium to capture images, these image capturing strips were measured according to their light sensitivity. The higher the ISO, the more sensitive they are to light, and the images they capture are much brighter. So if you want a brighter image, you need to adjust the ISO. But there's a catch. The higher the ISO value, the more noise you get in the image. Your picture appears grainy, and so it is still best to keep your ISO down. In mobile phones, although their cameras include very impressive noise reduction technology, there's still a point where pushing the ISO higher yields noisy images. Lastly, we have shutter speed. If a lens opening is called aperture, the speed of opening and closing of a shutter curtain is called shutter speed. Other than the aperture blades that opens narrow and wide to allow light, there is another mechanism that controls the speed of that light to enter into the camera sensor. This speed plays a significant role in capturing motion because a very fast shutter speed will only capture a limited amount of motion, resulting to a sharper capture compared to a slow shutter speed that allows more action to get recorded, resulting to a blurry image. The lower shutter speeds like 1/48 or 1/50th of a second produce motion blur that is common among film or cinematic look, while the faster shutter speeds like 1/20th or 1/240th are recommended for slow motion. And as mentioned in our previous video, we aim for a 24 frames per second to copy that motion blur used in standard filmmaking. But wait, that value number 24 and 24 frames per second does not mean shutter speed value of 1/24th. Setting your shutter speed to 1/24th will give you a choppy image similar to silent film movies in the early 1920s. In order to achieve the ideal motion blur, you need to follow the 180-degree shutter rule. This 180-degree shutter rule is based on a time when shutter curtains were still a circular mechanism that covers the camera film. This shutter requires a double amount of shutter speed to get that ideal motion blur that mimics the way human eyes perceive motion. Thus, a 24 frames per second requires a 1/40th of a second shutter speed. A 30 frames per second, 60th of a second, 60 frames per second, 1/20th, and so on and so forth. So there you go. Since our aim is still to mimic that cinematic look that we see on movies, we need to lock our shutter speed to 1/40th of a second. And since we use our mobile phones as our filmmaking gadget, and the phone cameras have fixed apertures, the only adjustment we need to keep on changing will be the ISO. Life has just started, and the next battle is set at color grading.